Nobody knew about the star. Not one person. In 41 years, it is 4 points, a 16th of an inch across, punched up inside the bell throat where nobody has any reason to look. My father, Refugio, cut the die for me on his lathe in 1983. I have put it inside every instrument I ever rebuilt, and in this part of Texas that is somewhere near 2,000 horns. It was never meant to be a signature. I did it the first time because I had rebuilt what looked like the same beaten-up E-flat 3 times in 2 years for 3 different schools, and I wanted to settle whether it was the same horn. It was the same horn. Last October, I sat at a card table in the band hall I retired out of with a dental mirror and a penlight, and I looked inside 191 school instruments, one at a time. 140 were empty. My son was standing behind me for the last 40 of those. If you're still here, subscribe to True Deceit Stories and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I like knowing who's out there. Now, let me take you back to March. My name is Eusebio Ibarra. I'm 67. I taught band at Cordova Flats for 41 years, and I've lived in the same house on Santa Clara Road since 1979. In March, a lawyer in Midland sent me a check for $346,000. It was my son's money, Raphael's. What do you do with a number like that? He was killed at a yard outside Odessa when a lift gate came down. He was 34. Do you know how long 19 months is, waiting on a company's arithmetic about your own child? It took the company 19 months and a lawyer I never met to decide what he'd been worth. And then it arrived in an envelope with a window in it on a Tuesday between the water bill and a flyer for a tire sale. I want you to understand something about that check before we go any further. I hadn't spoken to Raphael in 3 years when he died. Not since a phone call at Christmas that lasted 4 minutes. And before that, it was mostly birthdays. And before that, nothing at all for a long stretch because of something I did to him in the spring of 1996. He was a senior. He was the best percussionist I ever had in that hall, and I'm not saying that because he's dead. I've got the tapes, and you can hear him. He rushed, 1/100th of a beat in front of the line every single time, and there was not one other person in that building who could hear it. I could hear it from the back row with my eyes shut. That's what 41 years does to you. It's not a gift. It's a thing that gets built into you, whether you want it or not, like a callus. So I cut him. 2 weeks before the spring show, out of his own father's drumline, and I told myself it was so nobody could say I played favorites with my own kid. He never touched a drum again. He left in August. He came home 4 times in 16 years, and 2 of those were funerals. So that's the check. $346,000 for a son I cut, from a company I'll never be able to argue with, in a number that is not an apology and was never meant to be one. Odelia put it in the drawer under the phone, and neither of us said anything about it for 11 days. Now, our other son, Emiliano, and his wife Roylene and their girl Nayeli had been living in our back 2 rooms since the previous September. Roylene had an event rental business over in shirts, tents, tables, those big white chairs. It went down in the spring, and it took $109,000 of other people's deposits with it. Wedding money. People's mothers had paid her. They moved in on a Sunday with a U-Haul, and I carried Nayeli's mattress up the hall myself. I want to be plain about this part. I was glad. The house had been too quiet since Raphael died. Nayeli was 13 then, and she'd just made the drum line, 3rd chair, and on Saturday morning she'd come out to the garage while I worked and sit on the step and not say much, and that was the best hour of my week. The garage is a shop, has been since I retired. A bar of brass and woodwind painted on a board my father made, though it was never really a business. 3 districts send me their horns, and I fix them and they pay me what they think it's worth, and it's kept me upright since Raphael. That's what the money was aimed at. Not me. Everybody thinks these things are about an old man's savings. There were 4 of us in that house who would have been signed away with me. Odelia, who has never in her life had an account in her own name. Nayeli, who was 15 by the end of it. Emiliano, who lost more than any of us. And me. But I'll get to that. Around the middle of April, I decided what I wanted to do with Raphael's money, and I told Odelia at the kitchen table on a Thursday night. I wanted to buy horns. Not for us. There are kids in that district whose families can't make the instrument rental. $40 a month is nothing to some people, and it's the whole reason a 9-year-old doesn't play. I've watched it happen for 4 decades, and I've bought maybe 30 instruments out of my own pocket over the years, quietly, and it never made a dent. $346,000 makes a dent. Put in a fund, run right, that's 15 or 20 kids a year forever in his name. Odelia said, "He'd hate that," I said. "I know. He'd have hated it and he'd have taken the horn." And she said, "Then do it." That was April. I called the Education Service Center in Seguin about how you set up something like that. And the woman I got was a receptionist named Tandy Kessler, and she took my name and said she'd have somebody call me back. Nobody called me back. I called again in May. Tandy Kessler took my name again, and there was a pause on the line that I noticed and put away and did not think about for another 4 months. In June, a rented box truck came to the house, and Roylene and 2 men I didn't know loaded 214 instruments out of my garage. She'd told me about it 3 weeks before. The districts wanted a proper refurbishment program, she said. All 3 at once, on a contract, and she'd handled the paperwork so I wouldn't have to. All I had to do was the work. She'd get them collected and delivered, and I'd never have to touch a form. I said, "That's a lot of horns for 1 man." She said, "Take your time. Nobody's in a hurry." And I stood in my own driveway and watched 214 instruments I had known personally for 30 years go up a ramp into a truck. And I felt, and I'm going to be honest with you, I felt useful. I felt like somebody had finally noticed. 11 of those instruments came back to my bench over the next 4 months. 11 out of 214. I asked once, in July. She said the districts had staggered it, so the kids wouldn't be without their horns all at the same time, which is exactly the kind of sensible thing a district would do, and it's the kind of answer that at least closes a conversation. Here's what I want you to hear. That answer was better than the truth would have been. It was thoughtful. It had the kids in it. That is what a good lie is. It's not clever. It's considerate. If you have ever been handled by somebody who was good at it, you already know the part that stays. It isn't the lie. It's finding out afterward how much thought somebody put into keeping you comfortable while they did it. The end of August, Nayeli came out to the garage on a Saturday, and she had her hands in her sleeves, which is what she does. She said, "Grandpa, my snare sounds like a trash can." I said, "Bring it out here." She brought it out. It was a Ludwig, and it was not the Ludwig. Same lugs, same shelf rips, same district inventory number stamped into the second casing. Wrong drum. The bearing edge was cut, like somebody had done it, with a router in a hurry. And the shell was a laminate you could dent with a thumbnail. I sat there with it in my lap for a long time. Then I said, "I'll get you a loaner Monday," and I put it under the bench. And I didn't sleep that night or the 2 nights after. 10 days later, Tandy Kessler called my house. She said, "Mr. Ybarra, I shouldn't be doing this." She said Merrill Sudduth's office had queried 4 serial numbers on the refurbishment invoices back in early September, and there'd been an answer that closed it out. Inspection certificates, signed by me, all 4. She said she'd seen them. She said that signature was mine. I said, "I've never signed an inspection certificate in my life. There's no such thing for a rebuild." I write it in a book, she said. I know. That's why I'm calling you at home. And then she said the other thing, the one she'd actually called about, and I could hear her deciding to say it. She said, "There's a guardianship application with your name on it in Guadalupe County." I stood in my own hallway with the phone against my ear and looked at the closet door, and behind that door was my dead son's cracked snare drum, which I had not been able to make myself repair since the day it came back from Odessa. That's the part I keep going back to, not the money. On the last Sunday in September, I heard them in the kitchen. I wasn't sneaking. I was carrying a box of lug bolts up the hall. The swinging door stood open about 4 inches, and I stopped where I was because I heard my own name. Roylene was talking. Emiliano was making the sound he makes, which is not a word. She said the hearing was set for the 20th. She said the letter from the clinic was in, and it was fine. It was better than fine. She said Sudeth's office had gone quiet and would stay quiet. Emiliano said something about his father. I only got the shape of it, and then Roylene said it. He can't tell them apart anymore, and neither can anybody else. Then she said, "We'll do the pillbox after supper." There was no anger in it. That's what I want you to understand about her. She wasn't being cruel. She was doing arithmetic out loud in her own kitchen, and I was one of the numbers, and the number was 0. I stood in the hall until my arms hurt from the box. Then I carried it out to the garage and put it on the bench and stood there. 41 years in front of a band teaches you exactly one thing, and it isn't music. It's this. When something's wrong in a room of 60 people, you do not look for it. You wait. You keep the tempo and you let them play, because the moment you stop and start hunting, everybody adjusts, everybody covers, and the thing you heard goes underground, and you will never find it again. You keep going. You let it happen a second time, and you already know where you're standing when it does. The other thing is that you never trust what a person tells you about a sound. You listen to the sound. So I went back in the house that night, and I ate supper. I passed the bread. I asked Nayeli about her chemistry test. When Roylene came around with the pill organizer and filled it. Sunday, like always, at the end of the table, with the bottles lined up, I said thank you, the way I'd said thank you, every Sunday for a year. And then I went in the bathroom and I opened it and I looked at it. 2 metoprolol in the morning slot. I take one. The white one that thins the fluid off was gone entirely. How long had I been taking it? I'd been dizzy since the first week of September. I'd thought it was grief finally arriving late. I'd forgotten Meryl Sudduth's name in front of Meryl Sudduth in the parking lot of the service center, and I'd stood there in the sun and been frightened of myself. Who does that on a Sunday, at the end of a table, with the bottles lined up? I put the pills back exactly how they were. I closed the lid. I took the right dose out of my own bottles in the shop, and I did that every day after, and I let her keep filling that box for 6 more weeks. My friend Cipriano DeLeon taught ag mechanics at the same school for 30 years, and we've eaten breakfast on Tuesdays since Reagan. He also happens to know every lawyer in Seguin, because he's the one who fixes their tractors. He sat with me and heard the whole thing. And then he took me to a woman named Aurelia Basque, who does elder law out of a converted house on North Austin Street. She was kind, and she was fast, and she told me the truth, which was not what I wanted. She said the LLC was legally Roylene's. She showed me the certificate of formation from March with my own signature on it, my real signature, on a form I'd signed at my own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon along with the homeowner's renewal. And a thing about the truck. She said, "Do you remember signing it?" I said, "No." She said, "That's the problem. That's exactly what the application says about you." She laid it out. If I walked into the sheriff's office with a story about punch marks inside bell throats, I would not be a complainant. I'd be a 67-year-old man disputing his own signature 3 weeks before his own capacity hearing. And there was a doctor's letter on file saying I was confused. And the hour I opened my mouth, the rest of those horns would leave the state. She said, "What you have is a theory. What you need is her doing it, in front of somebody whose job is to see it." I said, "How much time have I got?" She said, "Until the 20th. That was the Thursday. On the Saturday, I took Raphael's snare out of the hall closet and put it on the bench under the light, where it stayed for the next 6 weeks. I didn't touch the crack. I couldn't. I just wanted the bench to have something on it that wasn't there, says. Here's the part I didn't plan for. That Sunday, Emiliano came out the garage after me the way he has every Sunday for 11 years. The drill press is a Rockwell. My father wired in 1978, and the start capacitor has been dying since I was 56. Thrown cold, it just hums. It'll catch if somebody spins the pulley at the top of the column. At the same second, somebody else throws the switch on the post. And those two places are 4 feet apart, and one person can't do both. So he came out. He put 2 fingers on the pulley, and he waited for the nod. The way Raphael did it from the age of 9, and the way Emiliano took over in August of 96 without anybody deciding he would. Neither of us has ever said a word during it. I gave him the nod. It caught. And I stood there with my thumb on the switch and understood that this man had been coming out to this garage every Sunday for 8 months while helping his wife take me apart, and that he could not say anything to me, and he could not stop coming out. That made everything harder. I want to be honest that it did. If you have ever gone on loving somebody while knowing exactly what they were doing to you, then you know there is no name for that hour. It isn't forgiveness, and it isn't a decision to forgive. It's that your arms keep doing the ordinary thing, while the rest of you stands off to one side and watches them do it. It would have been easier if he'd been all the way gone. Here is what 41 years taught my hands, as opposed to my head. Every October, for 4 decades, I tuned the loaner instruments before the fall festival. For free, in the band hall, at a card table by the uniform closet. Everybody in 3 districts knew it. It was the least remarkable thing I could possibly have done. So I called the band director at Cordova Flats, a young man named Adalberto Renfro who I hired myself. And I said I'd like to do the loaners again this year, all 3 districts, if they'd bring them. And he said, "Mr. Ybarra, you don't have to do that." And I said, "I know." 6 weeks. 191 instruments. One at a time at a card table, with a dental mirror, a penlight held in my teeth, and the shop book my father bound for me in 1983 open at my elbow. I played one long note on each one. I knew before the mirror ever went in. But I put the mirror in anyway, and I photographed the throat of every single one, and I wrote the serial in the book beside the entry, in my own handwriting, from 1984, 1991, 2006. 140 of them had no star in them. Now I had to make her reach for something. Aurelia Basque and Meryl Sudduth and I sat in Sudduth's office on the 2nd Tuesday in October, with the door shut. Sudduth is 60, and he'd signed those invoices, and he had gone gray about it. We built a lot. Seguin ISD, 81 brass instruments, the biggest refurbishment intake anybody had put out. And the co-op wanted Mr. Ibarra himself to sign the intake sheet in person. At the Cordova Flats Band Hall, Thursday the 16th, at 7 in the evening. None of it was real. There was no Seguin lot. There were 81 horns, and they were district property, and they came off a shelf in Sudduth's own warehouse. And I told exactly one person about it, at supper, in the ordinary way. I told Emiliano, "I want to be clear with you about what I did there. A year has gone by since, and I'm not going to dress it up. I used my son. I knew he'd tell her, and I knew he'd tell her believing it, and I knew where he'd be standing when he found out he had. The band hall has 2 cameras in the ceiling. They've been there since somebody took 9 uniforms in 2019. Sudduth pulled the recorder log himself, and Texas only needs 1 person in a conversation to agree to it being recorded, and I was going to be one of the people in the conversation. On the 16th, I told the house I was going to Cipriano's. At 20 to 7, I let myself into the band hall with the key I've had since 1983, and I went into the instrument storage room and pulled the door to within 2 inches, and I turned the hall lights off from the panel by the door and stood in the dark and listened to a building I know better than my own house. She came in at 10 past 7 with the box of Petsens. Emiliano came in behind her with a clipboard, because Sudduth's office had told him to bring one. 81 intake lines. She started at the top. I could hear the pen, and I could hear the paper, and I could hear my son not saying anything. And about a third of the way down, he said, "Roylene." And she said, "What?" And he said, "That's Dad's name." And she said, "Put his name on it. He signs whatever I put in front of him on a Sunday." I let her get all the way to the bottom of the last line. Then I reached around the doorframe and put every light in that hall on at once. All of them, both banks, the way they come up for a concert. And I walked out with the dental mirror still in my hand. She was standing at the intake table under all that light with a pen in her fist. I picked up the tuba on the end of the table. I turned it over and I read the serial number out loud. And then I said the month and the year I rebuilt it, which was March of 2009, and I held the mirror out to her so she could look up inside the bell. She didn't take it. She started telling me she'd come in, looking for the key to the uniform closet. Emiliano put the clipboard down on the table very carefully, like it was full of water, and he went and sat on the bottom row of the choir risers, and he put his hands over his face, and he stayed there. 4 days later, I drove to Schertz to see the doctor. Her name is Lurline Wendlandt, and she works out of a walk-in clinic in a strip center between a nail place and a mattress store. I sat in that waiting room for 50 minutes with a folder on my knees. I want to say what I went in there for, because it wasn't a fight. She'd seen me for 15 minutes on the 11th of September. I remembered it. My daughter-in-law had said it was about the blood pressure. The doctor had asked me the date and the president, and to count backward from 100 by 7s, and I'd been 3 weeks into being poisoned, and I'd got 2 of them wrong, and I hadn't thought about it again. Out of that, she'd written a letter saying I could not reliably manage my own affairs. I put the folder on her desk. 41 years of employment records. The shop book, the photographs of 191 bell throats with the dates written under them, and a printout of the certificate of formation with the March date on it. I said, "I'd like you to look at the date on the letter and the date on this." She looked at it for a while. Then she said, "Who was in the room with you at that appointment?" I said, "She was." And Dr. Wendlandt sat back in her chair and said something I've thought about ever since. She said, "She answered for you, didn't she?" And I let her. I said, "I'm going to give all of this to county on Monday. Your letter's in it. I'm not here to threaten you, and I'm not asking you to change anything. I wanted you to hear it from me first, and I want you to know I'm recording this. And I'll tell you that Texas doesn't require me to." She was quiet. Then she asked me what the star looked like. I drew it on the back of one of her intake forms. She said, "Would you mind if I kept that?" I left there with something I did not go in for, which was her file note from the 11th of September, printed and initialed, which recorded that the patient was accompanied by a family member who provided the history. 4 words in a doctor's file. That's what took the guardianship apart. The Guadalupe County Marching Festival is the last Saturday in October in the gym at Cordova Flats because the stadium's booked for football. 900 people, 6 bands. The gym doors at the north end are the double kind that bang when they let go, and they were propped open with folded mats because it was 79 degrees in there with all those bodies. I sit where I've sat for 41 years, 3 rows up on the west side, where you can hear the whole floor. Roylene sat with Emiliano and Odelia about halfway up on the south end. She'd been served on the Wednesday, and she knew there was an investigation, and she came anyway, because Nayeli was playing, and I'm not going to pretend that isn't complicated. Nayeli was on the floor with the drum line, 3rd chair, sticks up. They played the masked number last, all 6 bands together, 210 kids, and it was loud, and it was not very good, and it was the best thing I've heard in 10 years. Then Merrill Sudduth walked out to the microphone. He said the co-op wanted to recognize somebody. He said this man rebuilt the instruments in this room for 41 years, and most of you have had his work in your hands, and none of you knew it. He asked the room to stand. 900 people stood up on wooden bleachers at the same time, and I want to tell you that is a sound. It goes through the floor. You feel it in the soles of your feet. I walked down with a tuba under my arm. I'd carried it in from the truck that morning and left it under the scorer's table. I put it on the microphone stand's table, and I said its serial number into a live mic in front of the whole county. Then I said the month and the year I rebuilt it. Then I said, this one is real, and I've got 191 photographs of the ones that aren't, and I've had them since the 2nd week of October. I did not say her name. I want that understood. I never said her name. But I was looking at the south end of the bleachers, and so was Merrill Sudduth. And about 400 people followed us. She stood up before anybody reached her. She had her purse in both hands. The 2 investigators from the county came along the front of the bleachers, not up through them, and one of them was a woman named Pruitt, who I'd given 4 hours of my life to on the Monday. They didn't hurry. Nobody put a hand on her in that gym. They walked her out through the north doors, and the mats were still propping them. And the light out there at 6 in the evening in late October is orange, and it comes straight in at that end of the building. So for about 2 seconds, she was a shape in a doorway with all that light behind her, and 900 people quiet. Then the doors let go and banged, twice, the way they do. I looked from Saisun. He was standing up in the row with his arms straight down, and he was not looking at the doors. He was looking at the floor of the gym, at the drum line, at his daughter. Nayeli had her sticks in one hand down at her side. And she was watching the doors, and she didn't cry, and nobody made her sit, and she stayed on her feet until the band director told the line to stand at ease. Odelia had both hands flat on the bench either side of her. I have been in that gym for a graduation, 4 funerals, and about 600 concerts. That is the only time I've ever heard it be that quiet with people in it. Roylene Ibarra was indicted on 11 counts. Misapplication of fiduciary property over $150,000, which is a first-degree felony in Texas. 6 counts of forgery of a government instrument, because a district inspection certificate is a government record, and that is the count that carried the weight. 3 counts of theft, and 1 count of injury to an elderly individual by omission for the pill organizer. She went to trial in the 25th Judicial District in June, and she was convicted on all of it. 22 years, no parole eligibility for 11, restitution of $412,000, joint and several. Her name is on the state's do not hire list for schools, and that does not come off. Emiliano was not charged. He testified for 2 days. Merrill Sudduth kept his job, and I'd have fought for him if he hadn't. The guardianship application was dismissed with prejudice on the 3rd of November, and the judge said 4 sentences about it that I won't repeat because they were about her and not about me. The LLC was dissolved by order. Ibarra Brass and Woodwind is aboard on a garage again. 161 of the instruments were recovered from a dealer in Houston who has his own problems now. 53 are gone for good. Emiliano and Nayeli live in the back 2 rooms. He works at a feed store in Kingsbury, and he pays me rent I don't want and won't refuse, because refusing it would be the same as saying he owes me something bigger. He said one thing to me about it, in the truck in February, and then never again. He said, "I heard her say that in our kitchen, and I passed you the bread." What do you say back to that? He can't tell them apart anymore, and neither can anybody else. She said that about my ear on a Sunday afternoon in September, and she was wrong about the horns, and I'd like to be able to tell you she was wrong about everything. She wasn't. I couldn't tell my 2 sons apart either. I heard one of them rushing, and I cut him, and I let the other one spin a pulley for me for 11 years, and never once asked him what was happening in his own house. I'm 67. The money's still Raphael's. The fund opened in August, and it put horns in the hands of 19 kids this year, and it will do it again next year and after I'm dead. In March, Cipriano de Leon brought me a piece of mesquite off the tree my father felled behind the old house, and we cut 2 butterfly keys out of it on his bandsaw. I closed the crack in Raphael's snare with them. 11 inches of split maple and 2 keys of mesquite let in across it, dark red-brown against that pale shell, end grain against side grain. They will never take a finish the same way. In 40 years, somebody will pick that drum up and see straight away that it was broken, and that somebody sat down and put it back together, and both of those things will still be true at the same time. That's the point of doing it that way. I could have hidden it. I've hidden worse. I put a head on it in April, and I tuned all 10 lugs, and I carried it up the hall and knocked on Nayeli's door. She plays it. She's first chair now, and she rushes, and I have never said one word to her about it. Here's what I'd tell you, and then I'll let you go. Anything written down can be written down again by somebody else. A thing made by hand keeps the hand in it. That is not a comfort, and I don't offer it as one. It is only how it works. The truth has a way of sitting inside something, where nobody thought to look for it, for 30 years, waiting to be asked. She got what she built. I took everything back that could be taken back, and I am standing in my own garage tonight with my own name on the board. The paper will always match. When somebody is selling what you own and putting something like it in its place, they are the ones writing the paperwork. So the paperwork will be perfect, and a perfect paper is not proof of anything, except that somebody was willing to write it. Go and find the mark nobody thought to copy, the repair you made, the initials inside the case lid, the serial you photographed once for the insurance and forgot about. So I want you to check one thing this week, and it will cost you an afternoon. If you have ever signed a form at your own table on a Sunday because somebody put it in front of you with the renewals, go and find out what it was you signed. Sooner or later, somebody reads that top line. It ought to be you, and it ought to be now, while it is still the cheapest day this will ever be. If you got this far, hit like and subscribe to True to See It Stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And tell me one thing about the person who taught you whatever it is you're good at.